Clouds of tear gas, protesters in Berkeley, California there last weekend chanting, "We can't breathe." But of course they weren't thinking about themselves. Like demonstrators in New York who've been holding die-ins and shutting down roadways, they were thinking of Eric Garner, the Staten Island father of 6 who died after police put him in a chokehold. I'm Brian Lehrer. Welcome to the program. In the wake of that grand jury decision not to indict in the Garner case, NYPD Commissioner William Bratton has now ordered an internal investigation of the incident and officers involved. Bratton has already said that a few cops are poisoning the well in general. In his words, the brutal, the corrupt, the racist, the incompetent should not be there. We'll explore this bad apple theory in just a moment. Also on the program, we'll assess the city's major new effort to keep the mentally ill from languishing in city jails. Then in our public intellectual segment, a researcher shows how ethnic studies classes, now banned in Tucson, Arizona, if you didn't know, as insurrectionary, were actually reducing the high school dropout rate. And towards the end of the hour, grading hospitals ABC the way the health department grades restaurants. First though, police accountability. It's tempting to dismiss altogether the simplistic idea that aggressive and biased policing is the fault of a few bad cops. That would ignore the deeper systemic issues. But complaints against police here in New York do seem to cluster around a small percentage. While a majority of New York City's 34,500 officers, 34,500, have no or just one complaint against them. And those are just complaints, not proven. There are 1,000 cops, less than 3% of the force, who've earned 10 or more complaints. Now, it's the Independent Civilian Complaint Review Board, which receives and investigates such complaints. Joining us, Richard Emery, the noted civil rights attorney appointed by Mayor de Blasio last summer to chair the review board. Thanks very much for coming on. Welcome to our program.
Glad to be here, Brian.
First, would you remind our viewers or tell our viewers who may not even know of the existence of this board, what it is and what its mission is?
Yes, it's an independent board of citizens of New York, appointed by 5 by the mayor, 5 by the city council, 3 by the police commissioner, to assess complaints and to investigate those complaints and determine whether they have substance or not, whether they can be substantiated. If they're substantiated, we recommend discipline, and then discipline goes over to the police department. In some cases, we prosecute cases at the police department. In others, we recommend discipline, and then the police commissioner ultimately decides what discipline is to be imposed in the cases where we substantiate complaints.
What do you think of this few bad apples theory? You saw those stats or heard those stats that I was just putting out?
Well, I think there's no question that there is a core of truth to it. The fact of the matter is that we find now more and more, though there are fewer overall complaints, the allegations within complaints center around the actors, the police officers in those complaints more frequently. So there are more allegations of misconduct in fewer complaints, which would lend substance to the bad apples theory. I don't think that solves the problem of police brutality and police misconduct to the extent that it exists in New York. It is a very serious problem that we have to take very seriously, and I think the new police commissioner is taking it seriously on a broad basis because he is retraining every police officer in the force, and he's peculiarly and interestingly retraining them in many respects, certainly use of force and the like, but in one area which I think is particularly noteworthy, and that is discourtesy. As we all know, discourtesy is an igniting factor in any police-civilian confrontation. And if police officers can at least act appropriately, act professionally, then I think we're going to see a broad-based decline in complaints, because that assault on the ego of the civilian and the assault on the ego of the police officer will be de-escalated. That will be a huge effect. Nonetheless, the main problem with the most serious complaints does seem to center on a few officers, and in fact the Civilian Complaint Review Board is instituting as we speak an early warning system to present to the police commissioner focused analysis on a few officers with the most complaints.
I'm going to put up a graphic of the kinds of complaints that the Civilian Complaint Review Board tends to get from civilians. And there it is, forced complaints against the NYPD. And so the longer the line left and right, I guess the more complaints in that particular category. So it looks like the most complaints that you get is for cops having their gun pointed.
Well, that surprises me in the force category, but because I hadn't seen that. Is that coming out of our office? Well, it probably is. But that certainly is among the groups of complaints that we see all the time. Those are the force. We enforce what's called FADO, force, abuse of authority, discourtesy, and offensive language, FADO. And in the force areas, that's certainly what we see frequently. The abuse of authority area is another one that we have a lot of complaints in.
But look at what the second longest line is in various shades of blue and gray, a few beneath gun pointed. It's chokehold.
Right.
The same one that's salient in the Eric Garner case. And yet this is something that's been clearly prohibited, I thought. You get a lot of chokehold complaints on a regular basis?
Well, the chokehold, we did a very extensive study over the last 3 months that was published about 6 weeks ago of the chokehold phenomenon in New York City among police officers. Obviously, these are based on complaints. Complaints understate and overstate the reality. They understate it because many people don't complain when something happens. They overstate it because obviously some people complain invalidly. So somewhere in the middle there is some truth, if you will, of what happens with chokeholds. And yes, over the last 4 years, we had close to 1,200 chokehold complaints.
Wow.
And the consequence of that, it seems to be the consequence of the fact that it was never effectively communicated to the line officer, especially in the mid-2000s, that chokeholds were in fact going to be enforced as a violation of the rules, even though the rules stated as much. And in fact, even the police trial room exonerated people who were engaging in chokeholds in saying, oh, there was no intention to restrict breath, or breath was not restricted. The regulation says if there's any pressure to the throat, which may is the key word, restrict breath, it's a chokehold and forbidden. There are no serious injuries that we know of that have been attributed to chokeholds until recently. But the fact of the matter is that it is an illegal move, it's an extremely dangerous move, and it has been flatly prohibited since the mid-90s.
The number that I saw printed somewhere was 87. And by the way, we thank the website Vocative for the data graphic of the different use of force complaints, Vocative. But that in the last year, 87 chokehold complaints, I guess that's the number that was referred on the graphic, only one was confirmed for disciplinary action to happen. Is that your number?
Well, the fact of the matter is that there was, within the CCRB, my agency, before we got there was a very different way of dealing with chokehold allegations among the 6 teams of people who investigate them, the 6 groups that investigate them. Some required that there actually be a restriction in breathing. Some required that there be this intent to restrict breathing in order for it to be confirmed. And that was simply wrong, and we've corrected that there were these different ways of looking at chokeholds. Similarly, the police department was excusing chokeholds left and right. So the figures on the very low substantiation rate and discipline rate are a function of a very grave misinterpretation of the chokehold rule, which existed for close to 15 years.
So could that have come to play in the Garner case? Because the cops, the union, says that that wasn't a chokehold. That was a different kind of wrestling move meant to take him down. Mm-hmm. It wound up contributing to his death by partly choking him. There was also the compression of his chest that was taking place, which also contributed. But could it have been a misunderstanding or something that wasn't intended to be a chokehold?
I cannot comment on the Garner case specifically because the Garner case is before our board, potentially, if the police department does not pursue it, which we expect they fully will. But I can say that overall, the rule was misinterpreted, and there were clearly, in my view, a lack of discipline and a lack of focus by the New York City Police Department on prohibiting chokeholds over the last 15 years.
How about resisting arrest, there was a WNYC radio analysis that found that half the 50,000 resisting arrest charges against alleged offenders in the past 5 years come from just 15% of the officers, 40% of them from just 5% of police. In other words, the suspects accused of resisting arrest were resisting the arrest attempts of a very small number of officers. Should we suspect some cops routinely use these charges to explain away their own use of force?
Well, certainly over the course of the last many years, and I've been doing police abuse cases for my entire career, since the 70s in New York City, there is an action by the police officers to use cover charges. They're known as cover charges when they have misbehaved, when they've engaged in misconduct. One of those is resisting arrest. Obstruction of governmental administration is a red flag. Disorderly conduct can be a red flag. So one of the things we're going to do with the cooperation of the Internal Affairs Bureau and the police department is flag these kind of patterns so that we can flag particular officers for notable potential misconduct and try and prevent it before it happens. That's what the early warning system is going to be all about.
Does the NYPD have a database of all this that you, as head of the Independent Civilian Complaint Review Board, are not allowed to see?
No, we are working very closely with the NYPD now. I don't think this has been the history of the CCRB. The CCRB has been the stepchild of the disciplinary process. Now with Commissioner Bratton, it is no longer in that role, and with Mayor de Blasio. We are very much integral to the disciplinary process now. So we will have access to these databases, and they will have access to our databases. And we are collaborating on trying to deal with what Commissioner Bratton has called these bad apples. But beyond that, we're also trying to deal with the whole change in culture in the department.
There really is a change of culture, because for years there was reporting about how the Civilian Complaint Review Board was just seen as a nuisance or an irritant.
That's right.
By the police department.
Yes.
Now, of course, Mayor de Blasio has a different perspective on all these on many things, you know, not the least of which reflection of is that he appointed you, a longtime police watchdog,
right,
to the head of the Civilian Complaint Review Board. So you think it's real?
Well, it better be real, or I won't be here for long.
Right. I mean, is it real so far? Have you
very
been
much
there
is real.
enough to...
I think the mayor is going to put his money where his mouth is on the Civilian Complaint Review Board. I think the city council is. We're having presence in the boroughs. We're revamping the whole system. So instead of taking a year or more to complete an investigation, which is totally unfair to police officers and totally unfair to complainants, we're going to try and get that down to 3 months or thereabouts. We're doing everything we can to make this a credible, fair, and very viable entity, which it never has been.
By the way, one thing that Commissioner Bratton said on CBS Face the Nation on Sunday that really perked up my ears was that if the department decides to bring departmental charges against Officer Pantaleo or the others involved in this incident, it will be an open trial. Mm-hmm. This is, of course, not a criminal trial where they would go to jail, but it's a departmental trial to see if they'd be suspended or whatever.
Right.
Open trial. So unlike the grand jury process, which is closed, the public would be invited, the press would be invited, even maybe cameras?
That's apparently the case. Well, I know it's the case because when we try cases, when the Civilian Complaint Review Board prefers charges on particular officers and we go over there and try cases, they are open trials, they're public trials. There would be no difference when IAB does it. So I'm sure he knows of what he speaks.
Well, it's going to be an interesting spectacle if it happens.
Right.
The Attorney General's case, Eric Holder,
yes,
civil rights investigation. You're a longtime civil rights attorney.
Right.
And again, the grand jury came up with one conclusion at the local level. What do they need to find in Washington? And a civil rights case doesn't mean it's a racial discrimination case, right?
Right. No. Again, I cannot comment directly on the Garner situation. I can tell you as a civil rights lawyer what's necessary for a civil rights prosecution in any case, in any situation. And it requires a finding of intent to deprive somebody of their civil rights. Those are very difficult cases to bring. The state standards for police abuse and for police misconduct are much easier for local prosecutors. So I think you can infer what you wish from that about the Garner case.
We'll see what happens. Last
Yeah.
question. Cop cams.
Yes.
Now, of course, there was a lot of enthusiasm about them, and now with the Garner case, people are saying, wait, this one was caught on video by a bystander, and the grand jury saw it differently than the general public anyway. So what good are those cop cams going to be, in your opinion?
I think they are one of the biggest reforms and the most hopeful thing that has happened in a long time, because it really, a camera tempers the situation. That isn't always the case, and there are going to be ambiguous situations that are even on video. But the reality is, when a camera's here, you and I act more civilly than we would. Just beforehand, we were arguing like crazy. No, the point being that we all act better when we think we're being watched than when we don't. And I think it will be more of a deterrent than it will be a piece of evidence that later on is definitive of what happened.
Richard Emery, thank you very much.
Thanks, Brian.
When officers of the NYPD arrest people for both serious and petty crimes, often they're taking the mentally ill into custody. 38% of those in city jails report some mental health issues. About 1 in 10 have a severe diagnosis, such as psychosis. In jail, they don't necessarily get the treatment they need and can leave sicker than when they came. Last week, Mayor de Blasio announced $130 million for a plan where the police could bring certain nonviolent offenders not to jail, but to community centers for treatment and counseling. That's just one facet of the plan. How might it work best, and how did the cities, the nation's jails become de facto mental hospitals? Joining us, NYU psychiatrist Dr. James Gilligan. His assessment of the city's mental health standards for the Board of Corrections last year helped lead to the planned elimination of solitary confinement for 16 and 17-year-olds. Also with us via Skype from Del Mar, New York, near Albany, sociologist Hank Steadman, president of Policy Research Associates. His team worked on the mayor's task force on this matter, identifying gaps and strengths in the current system and recommending reforms. Hello to both of you. Thank you for coming.
Thank you for inviting me.
You've written, Dr. Gilligan, that today jails and prisons hold more mentally ill people than hospitals do. Is that a known fact?
It's a known fact. One psychiatrist, E. Fuller Torrey, commented that the largest mental hospital in the country is the Los Angeles County Jail. The second largest is Rikers Island, right here in New York City. There are more mentally ill people in these jails than in all the mental hospitals put together.
This must have been going on for a long time. Suddenly, it seems it's in the news over the last few months, and people are going, oh my God, the jail has a lot of mentally ill people at Rikers Island. Well, hello.
This goes back to over the last 50 years, since the deinstitutionalization of the mentally ill started. And it started for good reasons. The old mental hospitals were nicknamed snake pits, and they deserved that title. They deserve to be shut down. However, the original plan that President Kennedy signed into law in 1963 was to replace mental hospitals with a much more intensive and much more community-based setup of community residences, halfway houses, community mental health centers, and so on. That part was never put into place. We shut down the mental hospitals, but we put nothing substantial to replace them. The result is not deinstitutionalization, but trans-institutionalization from mental hospitals into prisons and jails. 50 years ago, 75% of people in institutions were in mental hospitals, and only 25% were in prisons. Today, 95% are in prisons, and only 5% are in mental hospitals. But it's the same percentage of our population that are in such places.
Mr. Steadman, same question, and staying on that history, those of us who are old enough to remember, as I do, know that that was supposed to be one of the great human rights movements of the 1960s and early 70s, was to get all these people who had mental problems out of these horrible mental institutions and back into the community. They weren't supposed to wind up in Rikers Island, or the next generation of them wasn't. Then we got the mentally ill homeless. So many of the mentally ill people on the streets who made up the kind of hardcore homeless population that people became so afraid of. But the original idea was to get them out of the mental institutions and back into the community. Is this a classic case of good intentions gone awry?
Well, I think so. On the other hand, one needs to be really careful in looking at the historical evolution, because in many respects, changes in sentencing laws had as much impact on increasing the size of the incarcerated population in the U.S. as did anything happening with deinstitutionalization and the expansion of the U.S. jail population. So that in many ways, you need to be careful that clearly the mental health advocacy movement and the young Turks on the mental health legal side in the early 70s, who really effectively went after psychiatry as using a standard of commitment of dangerousness and having no empirical basis for accurately predicting that, contributed to the fact that the state mental hospitals were unable to involuntarily detain people, and also that the state, in attempting to shift the dollars of who paid for mental health care, wanted federal Medicaid dollars, and as long as someone was in an institution for mentally defectives, as the term was used legally, they couldn't reimburse. So by moving them into the community, you could in fact get federal Medicaid dollars to support these folks that you couldn't in the hospital. So there was economic motivation, there was changes on the criminal justice system in terms of sentencing practices, there was a dynamic. It wasn't just shutting down the state mental hospitals, and I think that it's important to recognize that when we look historically what happened in the U.S. and how we got to where we are today.
Right. Even the pop culture back then. One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest, Ken Kesey's book, and then the movie. Geraldo Rivera came to prominence with his reporting on Willowbrook on Staten Island, and these things became movements. But then what about the funding, Dr. Gilligan? It was a matter of money to some degree, that the resources that it took to set up halfway houses and really let people who maybe were borderline, didn't necessarily need to be in mental institutions, but it would have taken money and resources that never actually came to set up these halfway houses?
Yes, well, remember, Ronald Reagan, when he was president, said government is not the solution, government's the problem. So the Republican Party, since that time, has been cutting funding for any government-sponsored program, including treatment of the mentally ill. The result is that the mentally ill have not been getting treatment, and they have wound up, as you said, either homeless, or in prisons and jails, or dead, or living with families who can't take care of them and don't know what to do with them.
So here we are in the present, and the mayor's new plan. Let's put up a graphic on the screen. And this is New York City jail population by fiscal year, starting with fiscal year 2010 and going through fiscal year 2014. It looks to me, Mr. Steadman, like the total jail population in New York City, this would primarily be Rikers Island, is going down, but the number of mentally ill people in jail is staying the same, so their percentage is larger. Am I seeing that right?
Yes, that's an accurate rendition of what the data, and that's also a national trend. It's not just a New York City trend, that the size of U.S. jail population in that time period that you have the graph for also has decreased.
So does this indicate that there's a move away from imprisoning people for certain things, but the exception to that is people with mental illness because they can't figure out how to move away from it for them, and so they're being, in a sense, victimized?
Bingo. That basically, that what happens is that we develop pretrial release programs. We're developing alternative to incarceration programs to avoid keeping people unnecessarily in jail. But persons with mental illness, when they're identified by police or when they're identified at intake screening and assessment in the jail, are not seen as viable candidates for bail because many instances they have long histories of failure to appear, and they're seen as a public safety risk, so they're detained. Whereas if you had some type of program, and this is part of a key element in the de Blasio mayor's task force recommendations,
right,
is if in fact you identify these people at arraignment and offer alternatives where they're getting supervision and medication and public interventions rather than being detained in Rikers, that in
right,
fact you can make a big impact.
in other words, bail.
Exactly, but ROR, release and own recognizance. These folks are poor. Poverty is an important dimension of what we're talking about here. They don't have money, so if they have any money bail, they're not going to be able to meet bail, and they're going to be detained unnecessarily, even if they're not a public safety risk.
I just want to share with the viewers an amazing set of statistics from the task force report. It identified more than 400 people who had been jailed at least 18 times in the past 5 years, accounting for over 10,000 jail admissions during that period. It said 67% of these inmates had a mental health need, 21% were severely mentally ill, meaning they had diseases like schizophrenia or bipolar disorder, and 99%, Dr. Gilligan, had a substance abuse problem. So the key to this is what? In this $130 million plan?
Brian, I would start by summarizing simply, in America and in New York City, the mental health system is broken and the criminal justice system is broken. And they both need fundamental repairs. I totally agree with Mayor de Blasio, who said that Rikers Island needs a fundamental transformation, not just around the edges, but really going right to the core. And I was delighted to see that he is proposing major changes in the policies that lead people into Rikers Island or keep them out of it if they're mentally ill or if they're adolescents and so forth. The whole system is broken, and it really needs to be repaired from the ground up. Fortunately, we have a mayor that I think is aware of that, Mayor de Blasio. I think we have an excellent new Commissioner of Correction, Joseph Pont, for Rikers Island. I think these are good people with good values, good experience, and I'm hoping that they will bring about the reforms that I think are necessary.
What aspect of the program do you think will work best for people, having seen the outline from the mayor's office?
I'd say moving the mentally ill who are now in jails like Rikers Island or in prisons in general back into the mental health system where they belong. You spoke of, well, the figures I've seen are about maybe 13% at Rikers Island have major mental illnesses, schizophrenia, bipolar, and so on. But up to 80% have major substance abuse problems. That is also a psychiatric problem. We know from generations of research that substance abuse treatment is 7 or 8 times more effective than imprisonment is in getting people to break their drug habit and to stop committing the crimes associated with drugs. I very much agree with the policy that you mentioned of focusing on the what we sometimes call the frequent flyers, the people who commit multiple repeat offenses. Yes, of course. I mean, look, smart policing is better than dumb policing, and a smart correctional system is better than a dumb one. A smart one is going to focus on the people that are the core of the problem.
Hank Steadman, this notion of diversion, explain it again very briefly, and does it work? Where has it worked? This seems to be at the heart of the program.
Basically, it's identifying people who, at the earliest possible point in contact with the justice system, can in fact be moved to community-based treatment alternatives with associated appropriate supervision that avoids incarceration or minimizes the incarceration.
Even before they're arraigned, when they're arrested, before they're even arraigned?
Ideally, police, instead of arresting, and part of the task force report of the community centers you mentioned earlier, and since 1987, when Memphis instituted a crisis intervention team training and the program for Memphis, Tennessee, they in fact identified a police-friendly centralized drop spot as a key element in effectively avoiding arrest in the first place by police. So that's a huge immediate sort of impact. Initially, I understand in Manhattan, and then in 2016 for Brooklyn. That's a huge asset. But then you're still going to have people get arrested. Many people need to be, either because of the seriousness of the charges, just the dynamic of what's going on, catch them at arraignment. So instead of spending 30, 60, 90, 180 days while they're awaiting the disposition of their case, in fact, they're getting medications, they're getting emergency crisis housing with supervision and medications, and they're getting case management. So they're in the community, and then the cases often get disposed of with time served anyway,
right.
And you avoid a whole bunch of that. So I think there's a whole bunch of alternatives. The Mayor's Task Force also has an emphasis that we haven't discussed so far, and that is doing better discharge planning from Rikers, so that people, in fact, get linked to appropriate community-based services, including housing. And there's a huge, important housing initiative embedded in there that will be specifically targeting persons who have criminal justice histories in contact, and giving them appropriate supports to keep them from being reincarcerated. So,
Dr. Gilligan, you're a psychiatrist. You have a hard enough time, I imagine, figuring out what somebody's actual mental condition is. It sounds like from Mr. Steadman that we're now going to ask police officers to do that, which is hardly within the scope of their training, or maybe now it's going to be, to decide on the spot, even before they arrest somebody or not, whether something different should happen based on mental illness. Can they do that?
Well, that is going to be one of the great social experiments of coming years. Of course, we need to try to do that. But there are so many other points in the system where we could bring about improvements. I mean, even to the degree that that may or may not work as well as we would like it to. There are still several points down the road at which we could intervene and start heading off the unnecessary diversion or the inappropriate diversion of the mentally ill into the criminal justice system.
And if these people with serious enough problems to be jailed over and over and over again, at least 18 times in the last 5 years, and all of them basically have a substance abuse problem, is there reason to have confidence or not that if they're diverted into different kinds of programs, that any substantial number is going to be able to stay off drugs enough to keep them out of criminal activity?
Well, there are two things we can do. We do know that substance abuse treatment is about as effective in terms of the number of people helped as the treatment for many very common medical conditions like high blood pressure, diabetes. This is a treatable condition. What does not work is simply putting somebody in prison. That does not get people off drugs. I mean, you can prevent them to some extent from having drugs, but they still get drugs in prisons and jails. Substance abuse treatment is essential. As the problem is, in America, we have treated drug abuse as a crime rather than as a public health problem. We need to rethink it as a public health problem. The more we have built up overcrowded prisons, the longer and longer the waiting lists have become for substance abuse treatment. This is crazy. It's an insane misuse of the taxpayers' dollars.
Can I ask you a personal question on the
Yes.
way out the door? I was reading a little of your bio, and it sounds like you never intended to go into prison psychiatry. This was not your passion early in life, not what you thought was your calling. How did it happen?
I was, as a second-year resident in psychiatric training at the Harvard Medical School. I was already married and had 3 children, and they were paying me about $1.25 an hour, and I couldn't pay the rent. So I could supplement my salary by doing an elective rotation in something I'd never heard of before and had no interest in, called prison psychiatry. I had been taught that people in prisons are untreatable. I thought it would be a waste of time on my part, but once I got into the prisons, I realized it was the most emotionally moving experience I'd had in psychiatry. I was face to face with the deepest human tragedies on a daily basis. I discovered it was the most intellectually challenging. I was constantly asking, what in the world could have driven this human being to commit the kinds of crimes that he did? And finally, I decided it was the most socially important problem that I could devote whatever skills I developed as a psychiatrist to trying to help solve. So I got hooked. I suddenly said I spent 25 years trying to break out of prison because I was so fascinated. It's a horrible environment to work in. It's terrible. It's emotionally draining. But it's also the most moving experience I've ever had.
And it seems like it changed your mind about whether they could be helped and whether they wanted to be helped in prison.
I learned that almost everything I had been taught was wrong. I had to relearn from the beginning. And I decided, we know what causes violence. We know how to prevent it. What we have lacked in this country has been the political will to implement the kinds of policies that I and others, colleagues of mine, have shown will dramatically diminish the rate of violent crime in our society.
And Hank Steadman, last question. $130 million. City's budget is, $100 billion or something like that. Is this a drop in the bucket? Is this just an experiment, or can this be transformative, or how much so?
It's a starting point. By itself, it can start to make a difference, and hopefully it can demonstrate success that will allow bigger chunks of money to come after it.
Thank you both very much for joining us. One of the most important things going on in the city right now.
Thank you for inviting us.
Time for Public Intellectual, where we look at new research with the power to change minds and public policy. If there's anything that provokes thought in the United States, especially in times like these, it's race and ethnicity. Even high school students start paying more attention when tasked at studying their own ethnic history. That's according to research done after a 2010 Arizona law banned certain Mexican-American curricula taught in the unified Tucson school district. The law came down on courses allegedly inspiring insurrectionary thinking. Research that followed suggested that ethnic studies courses actually helped kids to graduate high school. But the study had been done in a rush, so it was recently expanded and the results rigorously confirmed. The lead author is Nolan Cabrera, assistant professor of education at the University of Arizona in Tucson. His study, titled Missing the Student Achievement Forest for All the Political Trees, Empiricism and the Mexican-American Studies Controversy in Tucson, appeared in the October American Educational Research Journal. Dr. Cabrera, welcome. Thank you for doing this. Hello from New York.
Thank you for having me. I appreciate it.
Going back to the original study, what were you trying to find out?
We just wanted to find out if there was a relationship between taking Mexican-American studies and student achievement, because everything that had been done to that point was descriptive in nature, and any skeptic would say, well, all you have to do to prove something like that is to skim the cream off of the milk. You just take the best performing students and make them, put them in these classes, and of course they're going to do better because they were better performing to start off with. So we wanted to control for as many of those background characteristics as possible, and it was part of the federal desegregation case that was brought against the Tucson Unified School District over the last 40 years. And it was thought that if this program did have a strong relationship with improving student achievement, then perhaps it could also be part of addressing the gaps that were persistent in the district.
So how did you expand for the second round of this study? What did you do exactly?
Well, there were two big things that we did. The first was we changed we sampled different ways. We would take all students throughout the district, use those as a comparison group. But the big one was that we also looked at if taking one class was effective, then maybe taking 2 or 3 or 4 what happens then. And we actually found that, simply put, that the more classes that students took, the greater the likelihood of success.
2 or 3 or 4 what? Mexican-oriented ethnic studies classes?
Exactly, Mexican-American studies classes.
So these are history classes, basically, and study your own culture kinds of classes in the public schools?
And literature classes, anything that had to do with looking at these classes, or looking at a traditional class, but specifically from a Mexican-American point of view.
And you found what in terms of student achievement, not just in these classes themselves, but also outside in math and whatever else?
Absolutely. So we looked at was there a relationship between taking the classes and graduation and passing state standardized tests? And consistently across the board, no matter how we looked at success, how we defined success, that there was consistently a significant positive relationship between taking the classes and the outcome of interest. And that was really remarkable, as you alluded to, that even held for example, passing a standardized test in mathematics.
So let's put up, I want to put up a graphic that we have, and I know you're familiar with this because I think it's from your study, which shows the GPA, the grade point average of these MAS students
Yes.
versus the GPA of non-MAS students in 9th and 10th grade. So tell us what we're seeing here with the red line and the, I guess, orange line.
Okay, so the Mexican American Studies classes were only available to juniors and seniors. And so we looked at how students performed during their freshman and sophomore years. And we found not only did the Mexican American Studies students, or the students who would eventually take the classes, have lower first-year performance as freshmen, but their academic performance actually went down. I think their grade point average was something like a 2.1.
Right, so that looks like those taking the Mexican American Studies classes, MAS, have lower grade point averages.
Exactly. They had lower grade point averages in 9th grade, and that gap, as you can see in the chart, it even got bigger in sophomore year. So basically there was a gap, and it got exacerbated before the students could take the classes.
But let's flip to graphic number 2, and we're going to see grade rates of Mexican American Studies students versus non-Mexican American Studies students. I should say graduation rates. These are the graduation rates, and aha, here's where it seems to pop.
And that's exactly the point, that there, decades of educational research, there would be no reason to suspect that you would take the lowest performing students in the district and somehow miraculously they end up with the highest levels of graduation throughout the entire district. That doesn't make sense unless there was a massive intervention that occurred in the middle there during those last 2 years.
And what would that intervention have been? Common sense would say it wasn't just offering Mexican American Studies classes, because that seemed to be correlated with lower grades.
Well, that's the point, is that they took the students with the lowest grades and then actually transformed them into some of the highest performing students.
I see, by offering these classes.
By offering these courses. But you're right that it is a lot more than that. That if we take the founders of the program at their word, that it really tried to redefine the relationship between a school and the community, the teachers and the community, and making it so that they were actually embedded within it, changing relationships with parents, changing relationships with students. In many respects, these are students who were almost disregarded or were on the pipeline to drop out, were said, they were considered at risk. And those were the students who, in many respects, had never really felt cared for in a K-12 setting.
What do you think the mechanism is for associating these Mexican American Studies courses with a higher graduation rate? I mean, I could see how it's common sense that kids would like these classes. Okay, either I'm going to teach you about where your grandparents came from, or I'm going to teach you about the periodic chart, which is going to be more interesting to you. So sure, I guess kids would tend to find these studies, these kinds of studies compelling no matter what background they come from. But what's the mechanism by which it translates to graduation rates?
This is partly it's primarily speculative, but part of the program, because not all ethnic studies courses are created equally. Not all of them cover the same content or have the same purpose. And the ones in Tucson weren't just about learning the history, but it was about connecting that history to the community and the current conditions that we're experiencing right here and now, and really challenging the students to say, okay, what are you going to do with your education to improve your community, to improve your family, to improve all of these things? And so it blurred the line between, usually we say schools over here, and over here we have real life, and it intentionally blurred that line, trying to make it real for the students in their everyday experiences. And we see that now at the University of Arizona, where the Mexican American Studies students are here, and they want to do that. They want to figure out ways to take their University of Arizona education and use it as a mechanism for community improvement.
Why did politicians consider these kinds of classes insurrectionary? That's such an inflammatory word. What was the actual context for it?
So back in 2006, the labor organizer Dolores Huerta was in Tucson, and it was in the middle of was it HR 4437, the massive anti-immigrant law that was across the nation, or the Sensenbrenner law. And she said, based upon their record, that Republicans hate Latinos. And that one phrase became sort of the jumping off point for a lot of legislators to say, wait a minute, what's going down here in Tucson? And so then State Superintendent Tom Horn brought one of his people to give a rebuttal, where she said, as a Latina, I'm an example that Republicans don't hate Latinos. Attendance was mandatory, and the students were not allowed to have any Q&A. There was no engagement, there was no action. And so the students felt that they wanted to have their voices heard. So what they did was, in the middle of the speech, they stood up, took their overshirts off, and they had white shirts on that said, "You can silence my voice, but not my spirit." They then put blue painter's tape over their mouths and stood up in a silent protest against what they found to be just a form of indoctrination by the state. And with that, then Tom Horn said, "This is one of the most disrespectful things I've ever seen high school students do, and it must be related to these terrible, inflammatory, hateful classes that they're taking." And that was the beginning of what's now an 8-year-long battle over these classes. He actually tried to pass the bill that we know now as HB 2281 3 times, and the first time that it was under consideration, it was actually part of a Homeland Security bill. But it's part of that idea that the teaching of ethnic studies, in my view, it's a very radical viewpoint, that ethnic studies is not American, or it is un-American. And I think that if we take the melting pot seriously, that we need to take ethnic studies seriously, that it needs to be part of the overall discussion in the way we do education.
If that's the most rebellious thing he ever saw teenagers do, I don't think he spent a lot of time around teenagers. But in our last minute, is
Yes.
there now some form of ethnic studies that's being taught, even though Mexican American studies, as it had been, has been banned? Something that can help these kids with the graduation rates, as your study found, and is your study itself having an impact on reopening the debate?
So reopening the debate locally, no, because it's one that it's under consideration by the courts right now, and a lot of people are waiting to hear how that goes. It'll be heard by the Ninth Circuit on January 12th. However, locally, they are trying to re-implement, as by the federal court order through the unitary status plan. They want it's been mandated by the federal courts to have culturally relevant courses with a Mexican American and an African American studies perspective. And so they've been trying to implement them, but the problem is that the Mexican American Studies program that we had before, it was built over a sustained period of time. It didn't just spring up overnight. The teachers who were there were trained methodically over years and years and years and had honed their skills. And so what we have, we don't really, I'm not actually sure what we have yet in place. But the previous successes of the Mexican American Studies program here have become part of the larger national debate, as when LA Unified School District passed its ethnic studies requirement, and as California and Texas are considering this as larger parts of educational reform throughout the nation. So this is one of those rare examples where it becomes the great threat of a good example that's sort of spreading throughout the country.
Some places it's required, some places it's banned, and that's our national debate. Dr. Cabrera, thank you very much.
Thank you for having me. I appreciate it.
Up next, I think I'll have my operation at that hospital. It's got an A rating posted on the window, just like Burger Heaven. The system couldn't be simpler. If it has the letter A posted in the window, it's probably a healthy place to have lunch. A B is a maybe. C, maybe pick another eatery. The Bloomberg Legacy Restaurant Grading System now is much part of New York iconography as the dome light on yellow cabs. And it's inspired an academic paper that asks, if it works so well for restaurants, why not hospitals? Here to explain, visiting professor at the University of Michigan, Andrew Ryan. His article in the Journal of Hospital Medicine is called Grade Pending, Lessons for Hospital Quality Reporting from the New York City Restaurant Sanitation Inspection Program. Dr. Ryan joins us via Skype from Ann Arbor. Thank you for doing this. Hello from New York, Dr. Ryan.
Hi, Brian. Thanks for having me on the show.
It's incredible to me to think that this might actually be true. I imagine they go into restaurants and they look under the steam tables and in a few other places. A hospital has so many inflection points where there could be health hazards from, clean syringes and people using gloves to transmission of infection points, and I don't know where to begin. So is it what's really the status quo, and how can they even be compared?
Yeah. Well, I think 2 points there. I think that hospitals are very complex. They're complex organizations. They serve complex patients with all kinds of different needs, and the dimensions of quality are vast. But we've been trying to understand and study hospital quality for decades now. So I think we've got a pretty good toolkit to say, these hospitals, they provide good evidence-based medicine. These have low infection rates. These have low mortality. These have low readmission rates. So I think we know a lot about how to think about the relative performance of hospitals, but what we don't currently do is kind of report that in a coherent way that lets patients make informed decisions. Just to contrast with the sanitary grade program, the Hospital Compare, Medicare's program for hospitals, reports 108 different quality indicators on a website. So patients, to try to make a decision, would have to, basically have some clinical training to make heads or tails of the indicators.
Right.
And so it doesn't really lead itself to any easy way to make a decision about where they'd want to have their surgery, where they'd want to go for any particular kind of care.
And how can a hospital get a unified letter grade for everything that goes on there? Couldn't one hospital be an A for treating heart disease and a C+ for treating cancer or whatever?
Yeah, absolutely. I think, an ideal way would be to have, a global grade where we did our best to try to sum everything up and come up with a global composite. We put a man on the moon. We should be able to come up with a global composite for hospital quality. And, there's a lot of efforts that do this. But I think it would also be good for patients to have the ability to drill down and to have information on a particular diagnosis or a particular surgery that they wanted to get as well. That would be the optimal system. I remember several years ago, Nate Silver published a guide for New York City restaurants, and there was kind of an overall rating for different neighborhoods. But if you like this more, if you like that more, if you're more into, good restaurants or open spaces, you could tweak the parameters to change your overall grade. And that kind of system, I think, would be ideal and would really be a benefit to patients.
And the public would have to be notified somehow, right? You can't just find out, like at a restaurant, when you're wheeled into the emergency room and they're posted on the window is a B-. Darn, got this hospital. There has to be some kind of dissemination of this information.
Right. So, consumers who go into restaurants aren't making decisions about where to go in the same way that we, end up going to a hospital. So a lot of times, we might be under emergency conditions where we're taken to a hospital. We might be referred by a physician. That's actually very likely. And so it's not like you're walking around town deciding which hospital to go to. But nonetheless, we think that it would be meaningful and important to have those grades posted because, a lot of people go through hospitals. They would see the grade when they go in, and maybe if they couldn't make a decision at that moment, it would at least register. I think having the grade there would make it more salient. The media would pay more attention. It would be more widely known. The doctors and executives would know about it. It would just make the whole issue more visible and I think important.
Have you looked at the journalistic ratings and rankings of doctors in hospitals? For example, here in New York Magazine does this every year, New York's Best Doctors, et cetera. Is a journalistic rating system more reliable than whatever else exists now that's coming from the actual medical establishment?
Well, there's a lot of commercial rating systems now. There's, U.S. News, World Reports, there's Consumer Reports, there's Leapfrog, there's Health Grades. And what's interesting is a lot of these places actually pull the information from Hospital Compare and maybe add something else and then come up with their own ranking system. And so, I think that some of these systems, are better than others, but I think that the limitations are that they're commercial, so therefore they're not as widely disseminated as a public system would be. And, number two, the government can compel hospitals to report different information by virtue of the Medicare conditions of participation or have different incentives to report this information. So a public effort will be more, I think, powerful to get the kind of input needed to generate meaningful reports.
Are you actually rating primarily the success of treatment, the outcomes in treating various conditions?
So when something like hospital quality is evaluated, there's these different ways to think about measuring it. There's so-called process quality, which measures kind of how well does a hospital adhere to standards of care. So that's one way. Another way is the so-called structure of care. So does the hospital, what's their kind of nurse staffing ratio? Do they participate in certain quality improvement interventions? And then kind of another way is their actual outcomes, their mortality rate, their complication rates, their readmission rates, their patient experience. So typically quality is thought to capture all of those dimensions broadly, and how any reporting system is going to kind of weight those things is kind of idiosyncratic to the nature of the reporting system.
I've heard that nursing homes actually are ahead of hospitals in this respect. Is that your understanding?
It's true. So nursing homes used to do something very similar to hospitals. They were just a bunch of indicators. It was on a website. And, it was similar. It was around researchers would use the information, but I think it wasn't widely used by, families and people who would consider going to a nursing home. But several years ago, a star rating system was put in place. And I think the academic evidence, which is just starting to come out now, does suggest that those stars really helped patients to decide where to go. It just was more meaningful. They didn't have to wade through all this information. They could just say, what's the star rating, and use that to make decisions.
The restaurant grading system, of course, doesn't actually rate the food. Well, the Jell-O at Montefiore is a little watery, I've heard, or something like that. You're not going to rate the food.
No, that's right. I mean, we know some of the best restaurants in New York have kind of marginal grades. Per se has gotten a C recently. So
because it's about sanitary conditions, not the cuisine.
Exactly.
By the way, I see your office. You just moved in, right? You don't have any books on your bookshelves yet.
Yeah, that's right.
And it's not snowing outside, but in Ann Arbor, get ready for it. You're going to be locked in until around May.
Yeah, I'm missing New York already, Brian.
Thanks for joining us. Thanks for this perspective.
Thank you.
And that's it for today's program. We are here each week at this hour. Next time, infographics. We will view the very best of the year, including a map that shows who the highest paid public employees are in each state. It's usually the football coach, but New Jersey is different. Basketball. And do tune into my radio show, weekday mornings at 10 on WNYC 93.9 FM and AM 820. I'm Brian Lehrer. Thanks for watching.